Okay, all right. So, thank you for coming to this session. I know it's the end of the day. There were 5 tracks, so wasn't expecting a huge turnout, but doesn't matter how many come. We'll have a nice chat, talk about some interesting topics, hopefully, and see what happens in the next hour. So maybe we should talk about the title first. I'm not going to be sharing any pies today, unfortunately. There is no pie, but if there was a pie, I would share it. Actually, share pie is, we'll get to share pie, what that means exactly, but it's basically a talk about domain-driven design. If you haven't heard of domain-driven design, don't worry. It's nothing too in-depth or advanced. I think it's quite a good end-of-day talk, actually. So let's jump straight into it. And my name's Nick Tune, and I might upset a few people today from the Church of DDD. Might say a few things which go against some traditional beliefs in the community, that kind of stuff. So let me give you an example of some of the problems that let me explain a few things. I'm quite interested in domain-driven design, so I tend to do a lot of projects, work with companies who are interested in domain-driven design, and because of that, I also hear about people who don't like domain-driven design and have complaints about domain-driven design, like this guy, Todd Hansman. He says, domain-driven design is just awful. Everyone I've ever spoken to that claims to understand it has a definition that can't be applied by others. And then he gets to the punchline. Utterly useless. Might as well use tarot cards to derive your boundaries. To be fair, I'm not going to disagree with the guy. He's got some valid points there. I've heard a few people saying this. A couple of other people, not too long ago either, they were making some jokes about this concept of bounded context in domain-driven design. Sounds stuffy and arcane. What else is he saying here? Whiteboard warriors. I don't really know what he's saying there, to be honest, but I don't think he likes bounded context. And then Mr. Jimmy Morecambe here, he's making a bit of a joke about domain-driven design bounded context because they're supposed to be language boundaries, but it's not always clear exactly what that means. So not a lot of love for domain-driven design. And just this week, actually, Jeremy Miller, he was also sharing his thoughts on domain-driven design. I'm not 100% sure I've ever seen a .NET codebase where the team was consciously adopting and following DDD as an architectural philosophy that I didn't think was a necessarily high ceremony code. So, we've got a good spectrum of things people don't like about domain-driven design here, from these fluffy terminology to how people use it to implement their code. And even Eric Evans, the guy who wrote the book, he had some second thoughts about domain-driven design. And a few years ago, he was giving a talk and he said, if I could go back in time and do things differently, I would write the book in a different way to try and address these common problems people have about the tactical patterns and all this terminology. He talked about rewriting the book in a different order. He talked about this alternative DDD timeline where things could have played out differently. And I thought, well, if he can, I can. So I thought, what would my alternative DDD timeline be? If I could go back and rewrite history however I wanted to, what would I do? What would I do, change about his book or about domain-driven design? And I thought, he wants to change one chapter. Why don't I try and be more radical? Why don't I just have the whole book as one chapter? I'll just take one chapter from the book and I'll throw everything else away, and that will be domain-driven design from 500 pages to 30 pages. That's it. That's my alternative DDD timeline. This is where the Church of Domain-Driven Design starts breaking through the doors and carrying me away. You can't say that. But in truth, I actually read the Domain-Driven Design book every couple of years. I think it is really useful. Every time I read it, there's some pretty deep insights in there. And this one chapter, chapter 8, called Breakthrough, where this concept of share pie is introduced, I think that is one of the best chapters of anything about software development I've ever written. And I really believe if that was the first chapter, if that was the only chapter in the book, people would get more value from domain-driven design. And I don't think we'd see those complaints I was sharing earlier. I'm not saying it would be perfect, but I don't think, I'm not saying the whole book is useless and just read that chapter. Well, actually, that's what I am saying, right? That's my alternative timeline. Okay, I'm not saying the whole book, well, okay, So I'm going to talk you through chapter 8, and I'm going to draw some themes that stand out to me from this chapter, and let's see where we get to. So the first part of chapter 8, I think this part of the chapter really, it shows you the difference between someone who's experienced and good at modeling and designing domain models, and what separates those people. How do you know if you're a good domain modeler? So let me get straight into this. So chapter 8 starts with this line. So if I'm going to keep one chapter in the book and it starts with this line, I'm happy so far. After a long New York winter of refactoring. Now, I love New York, I love winter, and I love refactoring. So I'm just reading that and I'm like, oh, I'm there in that moment. I can feel it, I can taste it. But actually, there's a bit more to this. So after a long New York winter of refactoring, we had arrived at a model that captured some of the key knowledge of the domain and a design that did some real work for the application. We were developing a core part of a large application for managing syndicated loans in an investment bank. So now we understand what he's working on and what they've been doing in this long New York winter of refactoring. Nice bit of storytelling here, nothing too insightful just yet. But then, he starts to emphasize how important this story is. When Intel, a big company, bit of name dropping, even Eric Evans, he's a really understated guy, but he likes a bit of name dropping. When Intel wants to build $1 billion factory, so pretty big scale here, we're talking about serious application. When Intel wants to build $1 billion factory, they need a loan that's too big for any single lending company to take on. So the lenders form a syndicate that pools its resources to support a facility. To be honest, you don't need to worry about all those details of that domain there. Key thing is where this story's going, how he's building this story up, and we can see it's an important thing he's working on. It's not a to-do list app, yeah? Testing out some latest JavaScript framework, $1 billion loan syndication for companies like Intel. So we then learn about what his team's actually working on in this project. An investment bank usually acts as a syndicate leader, coordinating transactions and other services. Our project was to build software to track and support this whole process. So this is what his team's working on. Some software to track and support this process for an investment bank acting as a syndicate leader. Still not really getting into details yet, just setting the context here. So now we understand what has been happening over this long New York winter. We were feeling pretty good. 4 months before, we had been in deep trouble with a completely unworkable inherited code base. Who's inherited a code base before that wasn't completely unworkable? Wasn't my code completely unworkable? That's how it works. So, Eric Evans, he's just a normal guy. We see all these signs that we see in ourselves. So they had spent winter, basically, they've inherited this code base. I would imagine it's something procedural. I can imagine back in the late 90s, code was like super procedural then. Like even when I started coding in like 2010, a lot of procedural code around in .NET code bases then. So I imagine they've inherited some like super procedural code base and they've wrestled it into this nice coherent model-driven design, something with domain concepts and relationship, it's structured and so on. They were feeling pretty good here. But then the story takes a turn. We start getting into the details of this story. But there were some disconcerting signs. We kept stumbling over unexpected requirements. Got some opinions about that complicated the design. A major example was the creeping understanding that the shares in a facility were only a guideline. So, he's saying they've wrestled this procedural monster into a nice, cohesive, model-driven domain model, but now they're getting these unexpected requirements, and it's not fitting into the code. And the feeling, he's talking about feelings here, like they were seeing some disconcerting signs. That's how they were feeling, a bit disconcerted about what they were seeing. And so I think this is one of those points again, which separates typical software developer from someone who's good at domain modeling. As they're building this domain model, they're implementing these new features and they're feeling like, it doesn't fit in the model. We can implement it. A lot of people would just think, oh, here's some requirements, wasn't expecting that, we'll implement it, fine. But here they're saying, actually, no, this is more effort than it should be. And they can feel that the code base is getting out of control. So that's the first sign there. As an expert domain model, their intuition is saying, this is more complex than it should be. So then they talk about, we had accommodated this by adding loan adjustments to the model. The concepts here don't matter too much. It's more about the general patterns here. So refinements of this kind allowed us to keep up as the rules of various transactions became clearer. So the model was a bit awkward. They felt it was difficult to add new features. So they implemented this new concept, loan adjustments, which made it, what are they saying here? As they implemented new use cases, it was a bit less painful, but he's not happy right here. You can see here, the complexity was increasing. We didn't seem to be converging on solid functionality. So they implemented a compromise, which is helping them a bit, but they've still got this feeling that something's not right here. This code is more complex than it should be for these requirements, but we don't know why, is what we're getting across. And this is their intuition right now. What they're saying is, this model that we've designed, we can implement the features, but it's more difficult than it should be. There's something that they don't understand about the domain, which is causing their design to be complicated. That's their intuition here. That's what they're trying to get across. So, question for all of you, just to take a moment to think about. How many times have you been working on a project where you felt this code's complex and the reason I've moved my feet, have I broken everything? Okay. How many times have you been working on a project and you felt the code's complex and you've said to yourself, is this code complex because we don't understand the domain enough here? Have you ever felt that was the issue? We always talk about clean code, not enough unit tests, not following design patterns. But how often have you said to yourself or someone in your team, is it because of our domain knowledge that this code is more complex than it should be? There's no answer to that. I would just say in my experience, it's not something we talk about that often in most teams, except for these people who are experts in domain modeling. So, Eric and his team, next thing they talk about in the story, he began to suspect that these difficulties were symptomatic of a basic design problem. So again, that intuition, like this code is more complex than it should be. We've got a design problem here, but we don't know why. They know there's something wrong, they just don't know what it is. All right, so that's the first part of chapter 8. I feel like in that part of the chapter, it's all about intuitions and feelings, building up the story, talking about this model, sensing a problem, but not really understanding what it was. So what they do next is this. So suddenly, one week, it dawned on us what was wrong. Our model tied together the facility and loan shares in a way that was not appropriate to the business. Now, we don't need to know too much about facility and loan shares, and I think this phrase is a bit fuzzy and arm-wavy, not appropriate to the business. But what I get from that statement is, thinking about my experiences, it's like they've added some coupling in their code which doesn't really align with the domain itself. They've coupled these two concepts, facility and loan, but the way the business thinks about the domain, the way the business has mental models and talks about things, that coupling's a problem. So they're getting close. They've gone from intuition to, that's the problem there. Don't know how to fix it, but we know it's probably that thing there that we need to look at further. So Eric and his team, they go to the whiteboard with their domain experts, business experts, and this is what happens. With the business experts nodding enthusiastically, helping, we hashed out a new model on a whiteboard. We walked through numerous scenarios using a visualization of the new model. So really interesting thing here. We've got the developers and the business experts at the whiteboard talking through this model together, trying to explore it together. They felt the problem was their understanding of the domain. So the only way to fix that was by learning more about the domain, talking to people who understand the domain. And this is a nice little segue into one of the concepts from domain-driven design. It's not in chapter 8, okay, but I will allow it in my alternative timeline. It's Eric Evans' model exploration whirlpool. I don't think it's anything too complicated, but what I do like about this is it's very specific and concrete, or the advice it gives is it wants you to work in a very specific and concrete way. So he talks about scenarios, he talks about real values. So in my experience, where a lot of people go wrong is when they're trying to understand domains is they stay very high level. Something like, let's say, order placed. Order placed is something that happens in the domain. And if you just say order placed as an event, it sounds quite simple. But when you start plugging in concrete values like gold customer placed an order for $1 million, wow, what happens if we have a silver customer who places an order for $50? Suddenly, when you start plugging in concrete values, you start asking questions like, how can we change those concrete values? How does that affect the behavior of the domain? And you start to uncover much more details. And that's what this model exploration whirlpool is really all about, concrete use cases. I think people think that a lot of domain-driven design experts have built up years and years of skills and knowledge and expertise, and they can come and do these workshops and event storming, and they're experts. In my experience, that's really the most important thing. You can shortcut a lot of domain-driven design learning just by focusing on concrete scenarios. Just tell me a story about one particular customer. What's his name? What did he have for breakfast? What was the exact number of items in his shopping basket? Just doing those things, you can learn so much about a domain. And yeah, that's the emphasis of this whirlpool. It's about working through those concrete scenarios with domain experts. All right, let's get back to the story and see the example from Eric. So in his story, this diagram says that the borrower has chosen to draw an initial 50 million from the 100 million committed under the facility. The three lenders chip in their shares in exact proportion to the facility shares, resulting in a 50 million loan divided among the lenders. Again, he's being quite specific here. 50 million, 100 million, three lenders. That's the kind of thing we're looking for, trying not to be too generic and abstract. I would always say, try and understand the domain from the perspective of one user or one person as much as you can, rather than trying to understand a generic process for everyone involved in the domain. I think you'll get much more results that way. So back to the story, they had two deep insights. The first was the realization that investments and loan investments were two special cases of a general and fundamental concept: shares. Shares of a facility, shares of a loan, shares of a payment distribution. So this was kind of their breakthrough moment. They realized that this concept of shares had been missing, and suddenly, and this came through their whiteboard sessions with the domain experts, with those concrete scenarios, and now we see the value of a well-designed domain model. Suddenly, on the basis of this new way of looking at the domain, we could run through every scenario we had ever encountered relatively effortlessly, much more simply than ever before. And this is the importance of software design in complex domains. Think about how they were talking before. Complex model, it didn't feel right, it was hard to implement new features, they were really fighting with this code, getting out of control. They've gone back and understood the domain more, and now they've fixed this fundamental problem in their design, and all of these concepts and new features seem to fit together much more easily. That's a domain breakthrough. I don't think people talk about these things that much, really. I don't really hear developers talking about how excited they were about a domain modeling breakthrough very often. I hear them talking about, I don't know, GraphQL. Everyone's excited about GraphQL. I don't care about GraphQL. Tell me about your modeling breakthroughs. So, the key thing from the story is when you have a breakthrough in your domain knowledge, and you can use that knowledge, then have a breakthrough in the design of your domain model, and that reduces the complexity. And it also gives you a better collaboration with your domain experts, as you now have this clearer language. The way you talk, the way the software looks, and the way they talk, it's much more aligned. So, we thought we'd reached a good point in the story, but there's a problem. Eric says this: our new model worked well, really, really well. And we all felt sick. We were under a severe deadline. The project was dangerously behind schedule. Oh, what's going to happen here? So this is the final part of the chapter, final part of chapter 8. And I think the first part was about intuitions. Second part was about the value of design. If we get a good design, we can reduce complexity. Part 3 is about investment, about why it's important to invest in design. Let's just get straight into this. So, the gospel of refactoring is that you always go in small steps, always keeping everything working. But to refactor our code to this new model would require changing a lot of supporting code, and there would be few, if any, stable stopping points in between. So, we all read books, right? There's always a right way to do things. Red, green, refactor, work in small steps, and you're like working on a real project and like, actually, all that stuff in the book doesn't apply here. I've got this complex bit of code. All that perfect arm wavy stuff doesn't work here. And that's what he was finding. I agree. When we refactor code, we always want to go in small steps. But, when reality hits, it's not always possible. And that's the situation he was in there. He can see this beautiful model with his shares and his share pie and everything. But he's got, this big refactoring to get there. So where do we go next? So basically, he talks to his project manager, because don't forget, they've got this urgent deadline. The time to refactor isn't available. So the project manager gave us the go-ahead and told us he would handle the heat. I've always had tremendous admiration for the courage and trust it took for him to make that decision. Again, question for you. Just imagine you're in that situation. What would you have done? If you believe that you can improve the design of your code, but you're going to risk a deadline of delivering some new features, would you do it? Would you be prepared to take that risk just to improve the design of your code? It's just code. It's just clean code. It's all, I spoke to a CEO recently and he said, all my developers have OCD, always talking about rewriting stuff. Is this just OCD or is there some value here? Is Eric just a crazy guy with OCD or does design actually matter? And maybe it goes the other way. Maybe sometimes you're spending too much time designing your code and not enough time delivering. It could go both ways. And the third point here, which I think is super interesting, a great takeaway from this story, do you have a relationship with your product and project experts and domain experts where you could actually say to them, will you help me here? We think that we can clean this code up. It's going to have a big benefit in the long run, but this deadline's at risk. Would you have the people to support you? Could you even have that conversation? A big part of creating good software is having good relationships with the people who are around you, who are involved on the product and business side. So the project manager let him do it, and his team. The project manager even said he would take the heat if it goes wrong. Wow, what a nice guy. What did Eric know about that project manager? There's something missing from that chapter. He had some dirt on that project manager. He must have caught him in the cupboard or something. I don't know. There's something missing from that chapter, and I want to find out. But SharePie became the unifying theme of the whole application. Technical people and business experts used it to discuss the system. This is that language. By working on this model and this concept of shares, they introduced this new concept of SharePie. And even the marketing people used it to explain the features to their prospective customers. So that was that investment. By that project manager supporting the developers in redesigning the code to use this new model, look at all the benefits they're getting from this now. massive benefits. And there's another story here, which I think emphasizes something which is missing when we talk about domain models. So, the domain-driven design, the domain drives the design of your software, yes, but it also works the other way. When you're implementing a domain model, you can also change the domain itself. You can add new concepts in the domain. They added the concept called SharePy to the domain. It's a two-way street. And when you think about that, when you change your mindset to work in this way, you're not thinking, what's the best way to implement this domain in code? You're thinking, what's the best way to implement this domain in code, and how can we change a domain so that we've got a better product, or the design can be better? You're changing the code and the domain. You can add these new concepts. All right, so we're getting to the end now. What's he saying here? Just weeks after the release of SharePy version of the software, we noticed another awkward aspect of the model that was complicating the design. So again, final point here is this concept of breakthroughs. When you make it a habit to work with your domain experts and build your domain knowledge, when you have one breakthrough, it suddenly makes you realize, oh, now we understand this part of the domain better. I realize we don't really understand this part of the domain that well. Let's focus on this part over here. Let's have an event storming session to zoom in on that area and spend more time here. And then you get to the next breakthrough. And so this is important for another reason. And, I think this really jumps out to me. Our pace of development was accelerating. It's not accelerating, so over time, the rate at which they're adding new features is accelerating at a stage where most projects are beginning to bog down in the massive complexity of what has already been built. We have this belief, or from our experiences, every project we've worked on, over time the code gets worse, and it's harder and harder to add new features. But what Eric's saying here is that because they invested in this domain model, and because they themselves improved their knowledge of the domain, over time, they were able to add features easier and faster to the code base. Because adding new features isn't just about how clean your code is, it's about how well you understand the domain, and you can turn that into code. So, I use this analogy sometimes. At the start of a project, we're like an F1 car. We've got a fresh code base, we can add new features very quickly. Over time, it turns into this old banger, coughing and spluttering, uncomfortable. The business are putting pressure on us to get things done, but we can't because the code's messy. But yet Eric's got this alternative timeline where if you invest in design, you can actually get faster. You can turn your F1 car into a spaceship. And that's why I like this story so much. I think that's a great way of looking at things. When I think about my experiences, I think it probably is, I wouldn't say it's a guaranteed rule, but I think I see a lot in this story that from the good projects I've worked on, where we've done these things Eric's talking about, like working closely with domain experts, I do feel like we probably did get faster over time, yeah. All right, so that's basically it. It's going to wrap up on a few things from this story, and then this alternative timeline will be closed off, and we'll go back to the original timeline. So firstly, first takeaway, if changing the code is hard, it doesn't mean your code's not clean. It might mean your understanding of the domain needs to be improved. It might be gaps or missing knowledge. Try looking there first. Secondly, the domain drives the design, yes, but you can also drive the domain. You can add new concepts into the domain. And in a lot of companies nowadays, we're building new products that just haven't existed before. We're building the whole domain. Now, I worked at Salesforce when Facebook was implementing their marketing API. That just didn't exist before. Online social media marketing, completely brand new domain. Now, in these newer domains, we're driving the domain as much as it's driving us. And if you think about things that way, the mindset is not just how can I implement this in code, but how can we change a domain to make the code better? And then we talked about investments, designs and investments. Eric and his team did make a big investment with that big refactoring, but the caveat is that it needed to be trust to do that. If he'd have done that refactoring and his project manager hadn't have given him the support and it had have gone wrong, yeah, heads will be rolling. And finally, I'm going to have one final thing to say to the Church of DDD, if you're here. You don't need to worship the Church of DDD to get any of these benefits. We didn't talk about any of the terminology from domain-driven design in this chapter. All that good stuff and all of the DDD terminology, you don't need to use it if you don't want to. It's just common sense, really. These good things he talked about, these good habits, intuitions, working with domain experts, concrete scenarios, investing in design. These things will be timeless for forever, perhaps. I guess that's what timeless means, right? Forever. So those are my 4 takeaways, and you might have different takeaways. That's totally fine. Those are things that stand out to me. I've got 3 quick questions for you to think about. So firstly, what would be your alternative DDD timeline? If you've read the book, if you haven't read the book and you've just come to this talk, that's all you know about DDD, you can still have an opinion on that. It's fine. Secondly, which part of this talk stands out to you the most? If it was the picture of the pie, I'm guessing you're hungry and you want to go. That's fine. But whenever I go to a talk and I just get feelings of something stands out to me in the talk, and normally it's because I'm not very good at that, or I wish I did more of that, or I've never thought of things that way before. And so after the talk, I try and follow up on that somehow. Is there anything in this chapter 8 that stands out to you that you could follow up on that seems interesting for some reason? And that's it. We are now back in the original DDD timeline. Hope you enjoyed that journey into my alternative timeline. Thank you.